Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and a very warm welcome to the WorldSkills Premier Experience seminar programme. I'm Michael Oswald-Eston, the Partnership Director for WorldSkills London 2011, and on behalf of London and WorldSkills International, can I welcome each and every one of you to this seminar, and particularly to the panel who will be delighting us, I'm sure, with some magnificent input and hopefully stimulating a debate. I'm fortunate enough not to be chairing this session, and I'd like to hand over now to Judith Norrington, who will chair the proceedings. Thank you, Judith.
Thanks very much. I think the day, if it proves anything, I don't know if any of you have had a chance to go downstairs yet and see the exhibitions, but it proves the importance of lots of different young people working, employers working together, and a constructive relationship between the two. And what we're here to do today is explore the experiences of a range of countries, and we are very honoured to have guests from so many countries joining us to look at employer engagement in skills development. Sometimes the UK system is described as the one that people come and look at, but we think that there is no monopoly on knowledge and skills, and there are lots and lots of good practice from around the globe. And that's part of why we want to have this conversation, and we hope it's the start of a process where we can explore, find out, and learn from our colleagues and our own experience to shape the future. I'm going to very briefly introduce the speakers because I think the day is important that we hear from our colleagues, but also, as Michael has just said, that we have the chance to hear from you, your questions, your thoughts. And so I am simply going to go through, because I think you all have in front of you a list of their names. So starting on my far right, got Matilda Gosling, who has been very significant in carrying out some research, looking right across many examples of international experience in this area, and will be telling us a bit more about that. Michael Davis, who is the Chief Executive of the UK Commission for Skills. Then next to me, Dilip Chenoy, Managing Director and Chief Executive for the National Skills Development Corporation in India. On my left, your right, Debbie Martindale, who is the General Manager, Workforce and Business Development for, I think, one of the longest titles, the Aviation, Tourism and Travel Training Organisation in New Zealand. And on my far left, Ibrahim Boomgard from the Culture, Arts, Tourism, Hospitality and Sports Sector Education and Training Authority, South Africa. So a very, very worthy panel, and I look forward to hearing from all of them. We're going to be ruthless about time, so we'll have little inputs from all of us, but plenty of time for you. And I'm going to hand over to Matilda.
Good morning. The Manipal City and Guilds project we were commissioned to write was an Indian project which used evidence from international good practice to develop a set of recommendations for India, which is in the process of establishing sector bodies. We've written a version for this conference which focuses on employer engagement within a sectoral skills system. Levers to encourage employer investment in training include using labour market information and research to encourage involvement, using direct forms of engagement and dialogue, financial incentives and regulations, including tax breaks, direct subsidies, grants and levies, and provision of public training. For many organisations, issues such as market positioning, work organisation and job design take precedence over skills development. In order to ensure strong employer engagement and involvement in training, it's vital that employers feel involved in and are able to contribute effectively to the process of skills development. The degree of involvement can range from consultation and representation on sectoral boards, such as in the UK, to responsibility for delivery of training within a learning pathway, such as in the Netherlands. In the UK, the 2011 Wolf Review of Vocational Education suggests that employer representation on national panels is insufficient. They also have to be involved at the level of delivery. While this has worked in New Zealand and the Netherlands, it's been politically difficult to achieve elsewhere due to the need for funding to be directed through sector bodies. It's important that employers have real impact. Their presence on board should be real and not just a token gesture. This has been recognised in India, where sector skills councils are being established by the private sector, while encouraged by the National Skill Development Corporation and operating in a framework within which the structure and overall remit has been suggested by policymakers. Where employers have more involvement in the development of standards, greater ownership tends to lead them to higher levels of engagement with the overall skills development system. In addition to appropriate financial incentives, the extent to which policymakers are prepared to take a hands-off approach to sector bodies can have a significant effect on employer engagement levels. Permitting employers to have autonomy and independence of thought can also enrich skills development and dialogue. Balancing employer engagement with engagement from policymakers is central to success. If employers dominate the direction of the relevant sector bodies, policymakers may be unable to ensure that industrial and wider economic objectives can be achieved. Funding and regulation is a key method of ensuring employer engagement, whether by streaming funding through sector bodies, offering tax breaks, or by regulating involvement through levies. Financial incentives should have the outcomes of firstly addressing market failure by changing the balance of costs and benefits so that employers want to participate, and B, supporting the role of sector bodies. Effective incentive systems depend very much on the institutional and political context in which they operate. In Singapore, for example, employers are provided with an incentive to move into higher value-added activities through a tax on low-paid labour. The proceeds of the tax are used to train older workers in a variety of sectors. Financial incentives and training are thereby tied into Singapore's industrial policy, which is aimed at developing a competitive advantage in high-end activities. In order to engage employers of different sectors, sizes, locations and income, policymakers often have to use a combination of methods. The use of varied approaches, however, does not necessarily mean that the engagement is approached strategically or systematically. India, the most recent country to develop sector skills systems, has recognised the need to develop multifaceted approaches to employer engagement. Moving on to the conclusions of our research, many employers do not see the value of training until they've experienced it, and even then, only if they've had a good experience. This can in part be addressed by packaging skills development within other services which employers believe they need, ensuring that they are also involved in the design and delivery of these services, such as recruitment of appropriately skilled members of staff, training and staff retention. Channeling funding for training through sector bodies is one way of making their role important and relevant to employers. Employers are likely to dedicate less time to engagement in countries without historical tripartite responsibility or a social contract. This means that engagement points need to be prioritised. The time put in by employers is likely to be finite. The key point at which to engage employers is in the design and maintenance of competency standards. This is the base from which many other elements of the sectoral skills system flow. The needs of employers vary significantly within a single sector and geographic region, and may even conflict with each other. The involvement of training providers with good local understanding can help to reflect the diversity of requirements within training policies. Sector bodies are not, by themselves, sufficient to ensure that the needs of employers are understood. It is critical, particularly in countries as diverse as India, and even in smaller, less diverse countries such as the UK, that employers are also involved at the delivery level. This is the copy of the report that we did for Manipool City and Guilds, and Chris Sims from City and Guilds is over there and has copies if anybody else would like it. Thank you very much.
Right, good morning. My name is Michael Davis. I am what you would title as the grey suit behind 24 commissioners who lead the UK Commission for Employment and Skills. They're drawn from large employers, small employers, the voluntary sector, trade unions, further education and higher education, and come from across the United Kingdom, and their chairman is Charlie Mayfield, who is chairman of the John Lewis Partnership, which itself is quite an interesting business model. It's owned by the partners who work for it. Let me offer you 3 observations around a sector-based approach. Or I will if my notes won't stop falling off. Hold on. Let's try that way, shall we? Okay. So the first is that for me, sectors make sense, and in an increasingly global world, they increasingly make even more sense. But the important thing for us to hang on to is that sectors, first and foremost, serve how businesses find a logical way of thinking about their markets, about their channels of distribution, about the products that they develop, about how they finance their businesses. And of that, skills is a part. And of that, people are a very important part. And as Matilda's already covered, how people are used, the jobs that they have, the quality of the jobs that they have, all forms part of that sort of rich picture of how a sector works. Alongside that, sectors are dynamic and they change, and we talk about sectors that are growing, sectors that are declining, sectors that we want to rebalance. In the UK context, we talk a lot about rebalancing our economy so it's less dependent on financial services. Nick Clegg, our Deputy Prime Minister, the other day talked about the importance of craft skills and trying to grow the skills that really generate wealth and prosperity for the long term. So for me, the first thing is that a sector-based approach to skills works so long as the organisations that support it are themselves dynamic, flexible, responsive, and really are embedded into the wider industrial setting that they're seeking to work. Where they lose their sense of identity is if they start to become so skills-orientated that skills becomes the first word and the sector becomes the second word. Has to be first and foremost that they're about their industry, about understanding where their industry is going, what the challenges are, the role that people play, and then from within that, the skills that people need in terms of their success. The second one for me is about ownership, and there's a book by Matthew Crawford who he describes it as the case for working with your hands or why office work's bad for you. And he talks about the importance of people owning the skills that they have so that skills feel real, that you really felt that you learned something, that you acquired something, that of course, and of course I'd have to say this in front of City and Guilds, of course the certificate's important, but it's only one part of that sort of learning journey. So there has to be a sense of real ownership by the individual of the skills that they learn and acquire. And I think it's exactly the same for employers, that they have to feel a sense of ownership of the investment that they're making in their people and in the skills that their people have. And then when you again build that out to that sector context, what's really important are those sector bodies are truly owned by their employers. And I think the UK history of this is that when sector skills councils were formed in 2003, 2004, it might have been a bit earlier, but I wasn't around then. But the intention was very much about that these would be employer-facing, employer-owned, and in effect just initially pump-primed by government. But I think slowly over time they got increasingly captured by what I would call sort of government tasks, and for some of them really struggled in terms of having that much stronger and much more important employer-facing identity. So sector bodies really need to be truly owned by their employers, and then from that, a line that the Commission's very keen on at the minute is that we start to see much more stronger, responsible ownership of the skills agenda by employers, and part of the conversation that we're having with BIS, which is our Department for Business Innovation and Skills, is, you know, what would vocational skills look like if government was less involved and employers, trade unions, the education sector, awarding bodies were more involved, if there was a more, that this was an industry-led agenda in terms of driving skills forwards. And the final point, and I think Dilip probably can talk more strongly about this, is for me is about investing in clear outcomes. And I separate out those two words. I think the challenge is that we get captured sometimes by the funding, and we talk about which way should the funding flow. Should it flow through the provider, the college? Should it flow through the employer. But we always talk about that skills are an investment, that skills offer a return. In the UK, there's really strong evidence about the role of apprenticeships and that the returns they give both to the employer and to the individual. So if that's true, and it is true, then we need to think much more about how do we deploy public money as investment? How do we structure it in a way that we actually might get it back? How do we structure it in a way that it really does leverage additional behavior and additional activity from employers? How do we provide incentives that really encourage employers to reach out to those that are really struggling to get back into work? And I think that we've become quite clunky, and we only see sort of public funding as grant in aid, and it flows in one particular direction to a set of rules and tasks. And then that second word about, investing in outcomes then is that, again, qualifications are an important part of that learning journey and the skills that someone acquires, but they're just one part of that. And so we need to think about how do we invest in real outcomes, how are we investing in employers around a sort of a wide set of outcomes. So when the UK is really struggling with youth unemployment at the minute, about how could we invest in outcomes that are about work experience, graduate placements, internships, and qualifications as part of a basket of things that you would work with employers with. So, the three things for me are sectors make sense, but skills have to be firmly embedded into that wider sector context. Ownership is a really powerful context for the individual, for the employer, and how we encourage greater employer ownership is really important. And finally, how do we stop thinking about where the money flows and what the money is used for, and think much more about investing in clear outcomes? Thank you very much.
So I'll take off from where both Matilda and Michael talked about the India story. You've had a detailed presentation for those of you who were in the last session from Sanjay and Satya on what India is trying to do. But really, since the session is of how do we get employers engaged in skill development, it goes back to about 2007, where at an industry meeting with the Prime Minister's Council for Trade and Industry made 3 points. First, which echoed the story in New York Times, that a lot of the people who are coming out of the education system are unemployable. Second, industry does not have any role in determining the outcomes of either the skill development sector or the educational system. And third, there is no money for industry to actually do what it wanted to do. So our Prime Minister is an economist, and most governments decide that if there's a problem, how do we put the ball back in industry's court? So what we found was the creation of the National Skill Development Corporation, which was formed with 3 chambers or 3 associations in India. We have 3 large associations and 7 sectoral associations, and they were asked to form a board which would lead employer engagement in industry. And the government decided to give this board around $200 million in the first instance, another $100 million earlier this year, and saying that you've got to skill 150 million people by 2022. So industry was asked to lead the initiative to fund employers to skill 150 million people by 2022. And the chairman, who was also here, was from the private sector. I used to head the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers and was a board member of NSDC, was moved out then to my current responsibility. The second responsibility that was given to industry was that in the National Skills Policy of 2009, NSDC was mandated not only to create the vision for skilling 150 million people over the next 12 years and funding them by providing patient capital, but we had to create the whole ecosystem, whether it be the sector skill councils, the information systems, or train the trainer, or something very similar to what is happening here. How do you increase the visibility and the aspirational value of skills and vocational training, which was lacking in the previous incarnation of what the government was trying to do. And interestingly, the National Skills Policy of 2009, which lays down 10 specific roles for industry. So it said, not only you got to do everything that the sector skill councils do, is identifying competencies, doing the analysis and curriculum development, training the trainers, participation in examination and certification, also participating in the affiliation and accreditation process, which is very significantly different from the other countries, and then sharing of workplace experience, machinery, equipment, facilitating employment of trained people, and owning the skills development activity. So industry was given a charter of 10 items to do. Interestingly, the National Skills Policy of 2009 also has a role for trade unions, has a role for the non-governmental organizations. It's a very interesting model which is on our website. In the SSCs, in the sector skill councils, when we looked around the world, and we are new kids on the block, you know, and we decided that we would take what is working in different countries. And the model that we were following is slightly different from what is being followed in the rest of the world. Whether it will succeed or not, only time will tell. But the employer engagement is critical. So we followed a process. We looked at what's happening, and the City and Guilds paper with Chris and what Matilda presented a bit earlier is something which is after what we decided to do. So we created an approach paper. We got feedback from UK CES, Australia, INSO, and others. We did an internal review and improvement. And we presented the sector skill councils to various industry forums. And we took 3 decisions which perhaps were different from what the rest of the world took. First, we said that we will promote the formation of the sector skill councils in a sustainable manner. We won't give a grant. We might give a grant in the first year to set it up, but eventually they'll have to become self-sustaining and move to a commercial kind of an operation. Second, we would try and integrate the sector bodies. There were many sector bodies, like the Society of Automobile Manufacturers and Automobiles, or the Confederation of Indian Textile Industry and Textiles. The sector bodies would lead the formation of the sector skill councils, and industry would be involved. And the third, the accreditation and the awarding function will rest within the sector skill council. And this meant that once the sector skill council certifies the person, industry can't say that they didn't have a role in determining what was taught or how it was certified. So if you go back to the 3 premises, you will find that the third point is taken care of. The money was being given, so they couldn't quibble about money. And third, they couldn't complain about not having the right people, because they were responsible not only for setting up the training organizations, but also for setting up the organizations that were going to certify and accredit them. So we are looking at a little more than the normal 10, 20, 30 sector skill councils, because when you're thinking of 500 million people to be accredited, you can't do it in a limited number of sector skill councils. So we are following a 2-tack approach. One is that there are 10 sector skill councils which account for 80% of our employment. We're trying to get them up and running quickly, out of which the auto, retail, healthcare, security have been done. Agriculture, gems and jewelry, leather, food processing, and rubber would follow. But IT and ITES has also been done. It is run by NASSCOM. We have a media entertainment group. India is the 2nd largest entertainment industry in the world. We produce more films than Hollywood, but our revenues are much lower. And then other sectors have been done. We are currently having 32 sector skill councils in various stages of formation. So what we're trying to do is industry is involved in managing the fund. They're deciding not to give an aid and grant. We are lending money and taking equity in new entities that are coming up. We give loans at 6%. For some of you, the interest rate might be too high. For others, it will be very attractive. We are also ensuring that the sector skill councils lead the industry involvement in that area. And we're looking at the whole ecosystem by looking at a campaign, a national media campaign, in increasing the attractiveness of WET. We also are coordinating the India team for the WorldSkills. We have 16 competitors here. And we are looking at providing a mechanism for students to take a loan from a banking system to access WET going forward, and a whole lot of other initiatives in the whole ecosystem. So that's the experience in India, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
Just take this down. Kia ora, everyone. Good to be here. I'm going to take you on a very brief journey. I'm aware we're kind of running over time a little bit. So I'm going to try and get to kind of practical things that we're doing in New Zealand at the moment to work with employers and other stakeholders to bring together skill development. So our challenge is not just one stakeholder, but many. We've got to create value for government from a taxpayer perspective, for education to bring the provider voice in as well as the employer voice, to make it work for business, and also for the learner outcomes. We have constraints to work with, and these are things like time and dollars. Everyone is time poor. Obviously, dollars matter to people if they're going to be involved. Perceptions is probably the biggest constraint that we have to deal with in terms of the employers, is their perception around what will a qualification actually do for my staff and my business. So our strategy has been to bring together the different stakeholders and to some extent inspire and educate. So we've done research to let them know what's going on in the sector. I'm taking this from a tourism perspective. So we start out that way. We have a, generate some debate and look at potential solutions of what's required. And of course, being creative and in some cases getting employers to the table has required some kind of incentives around, particularly involved in research surveys to get the good response rates. We've found incentives are needed. Relevance, of course, is really important. If you want them to have a voice around the table, whether it's providers or employers, it needs to be relevant to them and their needs. And we've found kudos is also important. A lot of employers will get involved if there's some recognition in it for them. So at the moment we're working through the NZQA targeted review of qualifications in New Zealand, and this has been about rationalising qualifications, taking 150 tourism qualifications down to under 40. It's looking like we'll get to about 21 at the moment. There's no magic number. It's more about a sensible pathway of qualifications and taking very much an outcomes approach and creating flexibility so that what we do in the pathway and in the qualifications works for all kinds of delivery modes. So it needs to work for providers as well as workplace training. So in this process, we've put together a governance group, which is a new approach for us. Usually we'd have an industry advisory group. Now we've put together this governance group that has the industry peak bodies along with provider voices, and is facilitated by ATTO, and that's to ensure, again, that all the parties come around the table. We've also included an international perspective on the governance group. So City and Guilds, for example, are going to be partaking in that so that we can look at some international equivalents at the same time, which we feel will add value to both learners and employers. And taking a highly consultative approach. So during the consultation period, we have worked not just with our employer groups, but teaming up with the providers to work with their industry advisory groups as well. So regionally, we've gone around and worked with their industry advisory groups, and all consultation has involved both providers and industry. And then as we get to the more detailed work, we have what we call industry and provider advisory groups at a very detailed level that will work on the content and outcomes of each qualification. So for the future, we see much greater collaboration across the sectors and across the work that we do with providers. So it's not just an industry voice that we're looking for now, and probably some more creative engagement strategies so that we can get much more of a stronger employer voice around the table. Sometimes it's difficult to get people away from the workplace. Obviously, it's really important for them to do their day-to-day business, and in tourism, you've got 90% us me's in New Zealand, which is sort of under 20 staff mainly, and of those, 68% have no staff at all. So you're dealing with a lot of people who don't necessarily even value qualifications. So we feel creating value will be an important part to changing those perceptions, getting them involved more, having a very hands-on approach to that involvement, so we're not just talking to them, we're actually getting them involved and thinking things through in a workshop sort of situation. And hopefully from that we'll be delivering real value. That's it for me.
Good morning, everybody. Sawubona people from South Africa. Aita. I think the order of speakers today is a problem for me because you've got England, India, New Zealand, South Africa. I hope that come the end of October, that's not the order of the rugby other than India. So I'm sure we're going to sort Australia out the weekend and then we wait for you in the semi-final. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to chat to you quickly about employers in terms of addressing the skills gap. I'm going to try to talk quickly, so if you don't understand, it's okay. I think some of the things that we see as important for employers are getting involved in the setting generation of standards. The experience that employers have is essential in terms of setting those particular standards, coming up with what it is that we need to be doing. Their expertise obviously cannot be discounted in terms of what the employers can bring to the table. They also provide opportunities for future employees. So we believe it cannot happen without the employer. They're central to dealing with the skills gap, and I think we've discussed that to date. A very important role player, we believe, also is organized labor, because as much as employers want to do things, if organized labor aren't agreeing with them, sometimes those things don't work. So some of the things that we do back home or are looking to do back home, and I think you need to remember that we're in our third 5-year cycle of sector education bodies in South Africa, and we've learned a few lessons in the first 2 cycles, and we're trying to sort of implement those at the moment in this particular third cycle. Employers have always been involved in qualification generation. We invite them to sit on standards generating bodies, or have invited them. Going forward, there's a proposal that these things are not regulated as much as they used to be, and that these communities of expert practice would still involve employers, employer organizations, and organized labor in determining what it is that somebody needs to do in order for them to do a particular job. And that's important because obviously, hopefully that would allow for institutions of learning to align what they do a lot better to the job requirements. One of the challenges I think the world faces is the fact that especially academic institutions believe that they own the rights to education and that whatever they say is what's important. Unfortunately, when those academic products come into the workplace, and we all were there, we've all been through universities, the first day is extremely daunting because you have no idea what you're supposed to do. So rather we get these employers to talk, and maybe those academics should start listening a little bit to what the employers are saying so that we can align better, so that when somebody gets to the first day of the workplace, they're not someone who feels that they're an illiterate. One of the other things that we're asking employers to do going forward is to assist with data maintenance on successful learners. It's all well and good you train people and you get funded for it in South Africa, but nothing happens to those people. They just join the unemployed ranks and they go from learnership to internship, etc. Importantly also, one of the things that we get out of employers playing a much bigger role, I think we're going to start closing the skills gap globally. We live in a very small world. The inventor of the iPad passed on recently, and I think one of the things he's done, and he'll always be credited with, is making this world a very small place. The fact that I arrived in a country many thousand miles away on Wednesday and leave again this evening so I can be back home tomorrow morning to do things at home shows you how small this particular world is. You have a play called The Lion King that's showing at one of the theaters here in London. They come across to South Africa, and what do? They bring thousands of people from London to do the backstage work in South Africa. Why? If we can get standards sorted, if we can get globalization of standards, there's no need for that to happen, because the production company here would know that there are people where we're going who have these necessary skills and can do what they're supposed to do. I'm not going to go into too much detail in terms of the rest of my presentation. What I would obviously urge you to do is go through it when you have time. I think it should be available. South Africa follows a learnership model, which puts a learner into a workplace for a year whilst obtaining a qualification. It's regulated, and one of the challenges, and maybe India, one of the challenges for you is a system. And good thing that you're not going to be funding everything. Because when you fund things, I think people tend to abuse it sometimes. And therefore, it's essential then that there is legislation in place that governs how that particular relationship, how that particular thing is implemented at the end of the day. So I'm going to leave this here. You can go through it, etc. I don't want to take up too much time. But can I just end on the following? Employers have a big role to play in terms of setting the standard. There was a monastery, and a young man who'd studied, obviously, some qualification. I don't know what monks study. Went to, I've never been a monk, and don't intend to be a monk. Went to the monastery on his first day, And he got there, and he didn't feel intimidated. So he said to one of the older people at the monastery there, he said, "Sir, our job here is to copy the scripture by hand so that we can sell these handwritten Bibles to people to make money for this particular monastery. Are we sure we're copying the right thing? Because I see you copying from copies here. Should we not be going to the original and having a look at it?" The old man looked at the youngster and said, "You know, these kids of today, iPad junkies, etc." But he sort of thought about it, and maybe this makes a bit of sense. So he went and fetched a big bunch of keys, and huge set of keys, and the old man walked down 5 flights of stairs, got to the bottom and opened this heavy door. I went in, and about 2 hours later, the kid said, "Oh, I think I've done something wrong. I'm sure that old man's passed on, and it's all my fault." And he ran down the stairs. When he got to the bottom, the old monk was standing and knocking his head against the wall. All these years, all these thousands of years, all these years, we've missed the R. We've missed the R. The word is celebrate.
Thank you very much. I think with rugby and stories, and can I thank all the contributors for really useful and interesting points. It's over to you now to raise issues, and I'm going to start by saying who I am, because I realise I failed to do that at the front. I'm Judith Norrington from City and Guilds, and we'll be delighted to be supporting this event. If you could all say who you are before you speak, that would be great too. Has anyone got a question that you'd like to ask? If not, while you're warming up, I'm going to ask one. Because I think what all presentations like this tend to look at the good things. You have talked about some of the lessons learnt, but I think it's really useful because often you learn more when you get it wrong. So a very, very quick input from the panel or any of those who would like to on the things that they think they learnt, the big mistake that turned into the big improvement. I'm going to turn that way.
Yeah, yeah, I think maybe two things possibly. The one is an over-reliance on funding from a central source that does slow down what you can do, because I think Debbie spoke about the limited dollars that you have. And I think the second thing possibly is the challenge of regulating. I think you need to get it right. whilst you must have regulation to control things, it cannot be over-regulated so that you end up not being able to implement.
I think for us it's probably been the benefits that we've seen from actually getting around the table with the providers and employers so that each can hear each other's thoughts and we can get a clear pathway, because in the past providers have worked with their own advisory groups and ITOs, the skills councils, have worked with theirs, and this has been an opportunity to bring all that together, and I think out of it we will get something far more creative, flexible, useful for industry. So that's probably our best learning.
Thank you.
The biggest challenge for us was trying not to follow what has been seemingly successful in other parts of the world, and focus on the process of getting the sustainability part in and getting everybody around the table, than rather look at quick wins. So these were the two important learnings for us, and we are learning every day, and even now as I speak.
It was about a year ago that I first met Dilip, and he described how they were setting up their sector skills councils with versions of equity loans, and as he said, to build that sustainability in from day one. And as Abraham has already said about the over-reliance on public funding, and I think for the UK, not just for sector skills councils, but for a lot of organisations, we slightly got captured by the public purse, and it ended up calling too many of the shots. And I think that caused a number of organisations to lose focus about who their real customer was. So providers, colleges, constantly challenged to deliver against customer targets, whilst really trying to face into the challenges of the learners and the employers that they were trying to work with. And whilst no one likes austere times or reductions in public expenditure, I think if there's a positive to it, it's that there's less money, and I think we'll start to use it an awful lot more wisely.
I'm going to contradict what Dilip and Michael have just said, I think, which is, I think, one of the main things that we learned from the international research is the danger of belief from policymakers that sector bodies are going to become financially self-sustaining, partly because a lot of where employers have invested highly in education and skills, it's come from countries in which there's been a very strong social contract and historical involvement from both employee groups and employer groups, but also because policymakers, when they actually get to the point where they relinquish control and employers take over, even if it's possible to raise that money, find that they don't want to. So Canada, for example, the idea was that the sector councils there would eventually become financially self-sustaining, and all of the early policy documents said this is what we want, and then it came to the point where this would have been possible, and policymakers changed their minds because they still wanted some level of control over the training that was coming out from the sector councils.
I should say that I did ask the panel to be controversial, so we start with a debate. Please, at the back.
Well, my name is Shahid Zaki, and I'm the CEO of Amantech. I used to be the chairman of Philips Electronics in Pakistan. This is a job I've taken up. What I strongly feel is that we had some excellent presentation today, but I think it's also very important to look at your market from where the market is, in the sense, is it at an infant stage, or is it at a growth stage, or at a maturity stage? And then you have to do the employee engagement accordingly. Maybe in a mature stage of the market, you can standardize, you can do the sector on a uniform basis, but when it comes to the infant stage of the market, then you have to sort of make your approach depending upon whom you are talking to. Thank you.
Thank you. Kate Shoesmith from City and Guilds. Is it important to control the number of sector skills bodies there are?
So about the numbers, is it important to control? I might go.
Thank you. No. As I started out, sectors are, so if we forget sector skills and we start with sectors, then sectors are agile, they change shape, they evolve. And so for me, there's no perfect number. I think what's more important is the agility of those sector organizations to change shape with their sectors, to form alliances, in a UK context where we have increasing devolution of skills policy, to work with the various requirements of each of the 4 countries that make up the United Kingdom. So I think for me, it's no discussion about the number, it's all about the agility of those organisations to serve their sectors and to move as their sectors change.
Pick that one up.
Yeah. Thank you. I think that there's got to be a balance. So you can have a situation which employers are defining the sectors, in which case you're likely to end up with far more sector bodies. But you can end up with too many. So Debbie, forgive me, New Zealand has ended up with an awful lot of sector bodies, which has led, I think, to a huge degree of confusion from employers who don't know necessarily which body their sector sits within, and there are overlapping names, and there's kind of forestry and there's wood, and where does everything sit? So I think there's got to be some kind of ceiling level in order to keep the system relatively simple, but at the same time you can't go too far the other way. So Australia, I think they've recently moved from 11 to 10, and that means that there's not sufficient room within the individual sector bodies to respond to detailed needs within the single sectors.
If you go back in history, what are sector skill councils? They're nothing but what are the old guilds. And guilds have a very nice way of regulating themselves and to do a lot of things without any governmental control or without any outside interference. So the view that we are taking in India is that we're not going to regulate the number of sector councils that are going to be there. But what we are trying to do is make it very transparent. And in fact, it's very interesting because if you take sales, sales is common across many industries. And we are going to break our qualifications, and I know a lot of the awarding bodies are very upset with us because we're going to break, let's say, a pharmaceutical sales into 2 parts, sales plus pharmacy, auto sales into 2 parts, sales plus auto. And you could actually move from one sector to another by just doing the top-up and not going through the whole certification. So what we're trying to do there is to create a grid which is very transparent, and you know where the thing falls into place, because every, vocational training is about a job, right? And you got to get that guy fitted into that job. Jobs do not sit with educational qualifications. So, you have to come from a different angle, and that's what we're trying to do. And we are very clear that we're not going to either limit them, but we're going to take a lot of care in ensuring that the overlap is minimized, and even if there's an overlap, which will be there, if you look at oil and gas and energy and welding, and you look at auto at welding, there's going to be an overlap. But how do you address that? And we're trying to take that forward. Sorry for a long answer, but I thought.
Thank you.
Yeah, in New Zealand at the moment it is very topical around ITOs merging. As you pointed out, there's a lot of them, and it is confusing for customers. We have a lot of overlaps with hospitality, for example, with tourism, and hospitality usually being seen as one thing, and even when you look at Labour Department research, it's very hard to unpick some of that to find out the industry statistics that you need. So yes, totally take that point. From our perspective, we are taking the approach of looking at the visitor supply chain as a potential way to look at mergers. So looking at aviation, which is one of our sectors, as how you get there, tourism, what you do, hospitality, where you sleep and eat, retail, what visitors do in terms of shopping and leisure time activities, that type of approach through the service sector. And we'll see where we get to, but there's also a government review on at the moment of ITOs in New Zealand, which will finish about February. That's also looking at the role of ITOs. So until that's really clear, I don't think much will happen until after that. We could find that we're more like skill councils. We could find we're no longer involved in funding workplace training. We really don't know where it might go. So, yeah, until we know those answers, we can't really look at the functionality of merging.
Yeah, I think probably my sense would be a split between the two. As much as you want to be democratic and look at everybody, there's a big difference for me between what you'd call a skills council and a professional body. You can have lots of professional bodies, that's fine. But I think when you start looking at things that regulate and determine what should be done, maybe we need to have a little bit more control in terms of what we do, how they do it, etc. Because you don't want to have duplication. I think back in South Africa, management qualifications, similar to the sales one you talk of, has also been consolidated from 13,000 management qualifications which existed on our framework. We now have a couple of hundred, if that. And it can be generically done, and as you say, you do the top-ups for specialization. But I think we need to be careful between catering for everybody, but also making sure that there's some measure of control over what the end product is.
Thank you very much. And can I thank all our speakers? A lot of opportunity for people afterwards. Sorry, we're almost running out of time. Would you mind having a conversation with us straight afterwards? I would like to thank everyone very much for their input, and I think Michael has to go to another meeting, but everyone else is available. So please come and have a conversation. And if I could just ask you all to show your appreciation for the things you heard today.
Well, thank you, Judith, and I think we'd all agree it's absolutely a fascinating seminar. We've learned an enormous amount, I think, on a whole range of subjects around engagement of employers and the need to do that. That sectors make sense, that investment needs real objectives, that in India the challenge is 150 million people to train by 2022, and that the development of a sustainable model is really critical. I think there's also the challenge of stakeholders and how we interact with them, and the need to have an outcome-based approach in very challenging environments, and identifying what's important to employers and closing that skills gap, that global skills gap in a global sense, but not through too much regulation. And I was fascinated by the notion that sector skills are in fact the new version of the guilds, which brings us back beautifully full circle to City and Guilds. So thank you to City and Guilds for this. Thank you to you for coming along and sharing in it. Lunch is being served and there are more seminars at 1 o'clock. You're very welcome to join us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of WorldSkills London 2011. Thank you.